like to do this talk a little bit differently to what I've done before. We've talked about the important things in Teresa's spirituality, and that is important. But we have to realise that you don't become humble overnight. You don't become detached from creative things overnight. You don't become very good and related to each other overnight. And so we have to recognise, and we do recognise, that we have to grow in our faith. And I see the Mansions as Teresa's way of telling us about how to grow in our faith. But the growing in our faith has been the focus of attention right throughout the Church's history. And in talking about Teresa, in this talk I might bring in a little more others who have spoken about that growth, but looking at them in relationship to Teresa herself. And I'd like to begin by doing something that Teresa doesn't do at length, is to ask what happens before you go into the first match. Basically, she starts off with the idea of body and soul, and she begins with the idea of going within. And that's a certain stage in the journey. She doesn't here, and she does periodically talk about what happened before. But I would like to just take up a man that I mentioned before, Ruysbroek, a Flemish mystic, who lived 200 years before St Teresa. And I just wanted to share what he had to say about self-seekers in the world. In other words, I think you'll recognise here the sorts of things that Teresa is speaking against. And you can see that the things that she is promoting really are meant to help overcome these things that I would consider to be characteristic of many who have not entered the first mansion. He talks about the fact that these people are anxious to raise themselves above all others and to take precedence over the whole world. They do not like to follow anyone sincerely and desire that everybody should follow them. They are contentious and self-willed. They think they are in the right no matter who contradicts them. They're easily vexed, discontented, irascible, touchy, rough, overbearing and contemptuous in words, acts and gestures. There is no peace in their outward life and no inner peace. They watch and judge everybody but themselves and are very suspicious and envious. They have nothing but dislike, rancour and inner contempt for those who do not satisfy them. They are continually tormented and restless. They are persuaded that they know and do everything better than anyone else, always ready to instruct, inform, reprove and correct others, but will not suffer themselves to be instructed, informed or reproved by anyone. They think they are the wisest people in the world. They are quick to oppress and despise inferiors and even their equals if these do not give them honour. They are quarrelsome and insulting, given to railing, stubborn and sour of heart, lacking in unction of the Holy Spirit. They claim the right to speak before other good men, and in their own eyes they are the wisest of the living. They conceal pride by humble behaviour and malice by a show of righteousness. They are friendly and intimate with those who flatter them and treat them kindly. They cannot give sufficient anxiety, attention and care to their own affairs. They rejoice or are sad in worldly fashions as things go well or badly. They are anxious and careful about things which affect them: disease, death, hell, purgatory, God's judgment and justice. They are occupied with their own selves and fear and dread all that may come to pass. They are constrained and awkward in the presence of God. They are troubled by numerous cares and fears concerning the mundane. Bad government, that they may be deprived of life or fortune, that their goods may be stolen or detained by others, or that they may not be paid. They are afraid of becoming poor, wretched, despised, old or ill. They are without consolation of friends or worldly goods. I think you can see there many of the things that Teresa is speaking against. In the Mansions, Teresa sums a lot of these things up sums them up rather briefly. Many are in the outer courtyards of the castle, the external material, bodily, worldly elements. They are over-involved in the world, pleasures, vanities, honours and pretences. Their business and their external elements enter into their prayer. So that's the sort of life that I do think many live. Even though Ruysbroeck lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago, I think the insight into human nature is exact. And I think what Teresa is speaking against is the type of life that he describes. When we begin to look at the interior castle, we are struck by the title, The Interior Castle. And Teresa said at one time when she was at prayer, she had this image come to her of the soul as a castle made of diamond, and that the light within the diamond spread throughout the whole of the castle. And she speaks about there being many rooms in the castle. And that's clearly a reference to chapter 14 of St John, verse 2. And I want to just take that up a bit, because I wonder what Teresa was praying about when that image came to her and she received the inspiration to write as she did in the interior castle. In verse 2, Jesus says, "In my Father's house there are many mansions, otherwise I would have told you, and I go and prepare a mansion, prepare a way for you, and I will come back and take you to where I am." And in verse 23, we have another saying of Jesus, where he says that if a person loves me and keeps my word, my Father and I will come and make our mansion with him. In other words, it's a play on the two words, mansion. It's the same Greek word, and unfortunately in most Bibles you don't have it translated that way. But I want to point out that the imagery here is the idea of God living within. And if we just work through that particular chapter, or from verse 2 to 23 of that chapter, I think we see things that Teresa is influenced by as she comes to approach this interior castle. That after saying that there are many mansions, Jesus says he's going away. And Thomas, the apostle, says, "Where are you going? We don't know the way." And Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life." And after that, he begins to talk about the fact that he's going to the Father. And Philip, another one of the apostles, says, "Lord, show us the Father." And Jesus said to him, "Father, Philip, I have been with you for so long. Don't you know who I am? For I am in the Father, and the Father is in me." So to look at Jesus is to see the Father. And he then goes on to talk about the fact that when he goes to the Father, he will send the Paraclete to the believers. And the Paraclete, they will know the Paraclete, because the Paraclete will dwell with them and be in them. So that interior presence of the divine is coming through very strongly. Then another of the apostles pipes up and says, "Why is it that you're coming to us and not to the world?" And Jesus begins to say that that the link that he has with the apostles, he says that, "Do you not know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and me in you?" So there we see that deep link, not only between the Father and Jesus, but that we are called into that as well. And it's in the context then that he says that if anyone loves me, they will keep my word, and my Father will love them, and we will come and make our mansion in him. It's not uncommon when people pull a reference out of the scripture that they do mean more than just the reference. And I think that chapter is so intensely linked to what Teresa is doing that perhaps this may well have been what she was praying about when she came up with the image of the castle. I often use the example of Jesus on the cross when he said, "Father, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And you could look upon that as a prayer of desperation. Really, it's the first verse of Psalm 21, which is a psalm of confidence and trust in God. So that just the presence of one verse captures really what the whole psalm is about. So I wanted to begin by just giving that scriptural background to what I believe is an important framework within which we can see Teresa. She talks about the marvellous capacity that we have to be with the Lord. That she begins by talking about the dignity that we are called to, that the Lord is present within. She makes the point that most of us, or a lot of us, are caught up with the setting of this great diamond, namely the body. We are body and soul. We get caught up with the body, but ultimately we do need to go within to find out the meaning of who we are. She talks about the entry to the castle as prayer and meditation. I've used the term prayer and reflection there. The point she's making is that we need to reflect, to meditate on the mystery that I've just been talking about and which she singles out, namely the great dignity that we have in our heart, that the Lord is there, is within, and we should be there with him. And what she's going to develop here is a sort of a conflict, a tension between the world outside that's drawing us in this direction and the Lord within, who is drawing us in this direction. And the movement within, as we begin to reflect on the Lord within us, and that is a reflection on who we are, people of great dignity, called to share the life of the Trinity, that as we step in, we'll see in the first mansion, the person still has one foot in the world, as it were. The world, if you like, is the stronger, has the stronger pull. But as the soul enters more deeply into the mansions, then the call of God becomes stronger, and the person enters into a deeper union with the Lord. So that sort of tension, I think, is something that's there in the overall presence of the interior castle. She talks about the lack of self-knowledge. In other words, if you're in that outside world, you haven't really come to be who you are. And it's by prayer and meditation that we enter in. Not any prayer or any meditation. I think she's saying prayer and meditation on the presence of the Lord who is within. She talks about these people. I read to you those things that she says about those outside, but those inside are really don't have a great deal in their life that will take them in the direction of the Lord. She says they have some self-knowledge, and of course the very first mansion is the mansion of self-knowledge, where we begin to understand who we are, not just in terms of psychological insights, but in terms of being those who are called to share in the life of the Lord who lives within. They have good desires, and sometimes they realise that they're not travelling well. In other words, the very fact that they've got one foot in the castle means that they're aware that there is something else, something other than what they have in the world outside. And so they begin to be more conscious about their life. They desire, she says, not to offend God and to do good works. But they're still weak. And it's that weakness that is so apparent as people begin. And it can only be a strengthening of that takes them on, or if they fail in that, then they slip back into the world. She uses the example of Lot's wife. Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. And she's saying, well, don't go back, right? But that's not going to help if you start going back to the world. I wanted to mention particularly the vision of mortal sin. She talks about this in the first mansion and makes quite a piece of it because it had a great influence on her. And she saw it in terms of a dark blanket being thrown over the diamond so that nothing could come out. And really the soul could do nothing that was good when the light from within was not shining. And she learned two things from that, she says, and you'll find them in the notes there. The first was the great fear of falling into mortal sin because it's so incapacitated the soul and really destroyed who we are. But the second thing that she speaks about is it's a mirror of humility. In other words, what that showed her, that without the God within, without the Lord within, we can't do anything at all. If we throw the blanket over the light, then there is no light and there is no goodness coming out of our heart. And that's something that stays with her right throughout, that really we cannot do anything on our own. We need the grace of God, and by the end of the seventh Masion, we'll see there are special graces that God comes and gives to us. So she's talking here about humility. Humility will occur frequently. We've already seen that it's the way to bring the king to checkmate. It's the way of acknowledging that we've got to be ready to do what the Lord wants rather than our own will. And that will emerge as we go along. She says that humility works like the bee, just as we talk about a busy bee. Well, we need a busy humility that's constantly reminding us of who we are in relationship to God, and that we cannot do anything real without Him. How are we to go on? We are to go on by focusing on God. This person has one leg in the world still, so their gaze does tend to be still back from the way that they came. But to go forward means that you need to focus on the Lord. And it's that focusing on the Lord that will make you open to be drawn on and to be empowered to undertake the journey. So the way forward is to be free of the things that hold one back. So the person is entering into a journey where they're going to have to work to overcome the things that they've inherited from their previous life outside the castle. She says they are deaf and dumb. They can't hear clearly the call that's coming from within. They're too caught up with the noise of the world. And they're dumb in the sense that they haven't sort of worked out how to respond to this Lord who is calling them. So it's a very early stage, but they have been drawn into the castle. I've just put it there, the light from the centre is not strong. So it's beginning, and Teresa makes the point they've done a great thing in beginning, but they need to go on. The second mansion, as I've presented it there, the dwellers have begun to pray. Right? So the prayer, the awareness of the Lord who is within is growing, and those people are beginning to pray more, she says. That they understand the importance of moving on. They recognise that they've only just started the journey, but she makes the point that they lack very much determination. That these people are still able to fall, they have the strength to avoid the occasions of sin, and can still be drawn back, not totally into the world, but they still haven't forgotten what the world is about. She says that there is more effort needed, but there's less danger. Less danger because the people have some self-knowledge. They have some understanding of the Lord who is within. So there isn't the danger that was there before. They know something of what is happening, but more effort is required. In other words, it's not easy at this early stage to break away from what has been there before. She goes on to say, they can hear the call of the Lord which is coming to them in a variety of ways. Sermons, good people, books, illnesses and trials. I was looking at Roysbrook because I just quoted him recently, and I came across something from him that was so like that, and I just wanted to point it out because I'm trying to show that Teresa is looking at this journey to God which many have looked at before. She has her own unique contribution that she's making. But Roysbrook says that prevenient grace, that's the grace that touches people and draws them to God, it can come from without or within. Without sickness, loss of material goods, reputation, public humiliation, preaching and the example of good people. Thus God leads one to know oneself as he is, shows the need for God. I think that's what Teresa is saying, that God comes to us through other people, through sickness and through trials. And what does that do? It shows us that we need God, that we just cannot go on alone. Within, she says, the consideration of the passion of Jesus, he says, what God has done for them, one's own sins, the shortness of life, the fear of hell, the eternal joy of heaven, that God has forgiven one's sins, that God awaits one's conversion, and the greatness of creation. So I just want to point out that while we see things there in Teresa that really just not asides, they're more than that, but they're not developed. But really they are things that are important, and that others who have studied the journey to God have seen their importance and spoken about them. She says here that this is a difficult mansion, right? That this is really where the person is coming to grips with the departure from the world in which they have lived. Perseverance is the key. That really the person just has to persevere. She said earlier that the first group were deaf and dumb, but here the person is no longer deaf. They can begin to hear the call of God a little more clearly. And in doing that, they are drawn on, but she still considers them to be dumb in the sense that they don't have that ability to respond in the way that they will have as they move further into the mansions. She says the dweller begins to realise that the things of the world cannot provide true happiness. So I mentioned earlier the tension between the world and the Lord within. As the souls, the person travels through the mansions, they begin to realise that the world is not able to provide the happiness for which they're looking. St Augustine, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, until we rest in you we find no rest at all. That's becoming clear, that it's only in God that that can happen. It's the guest in the heart, she says, that does everything. And that over-involvement of the world is an obstacle. And she acknowledges elsewhere, and she doesn't mention it here, but we are all involved in the world, that we've got our life that we're going to lead, and Teresa's very insistent that we lead the life that we need to lead. So to emphasise this movement within is not a movement away from our responsibilities and a suggestion that what our life is about is wrong. No, it's simply acknowledging that we mustn't get over-involved in the things of the world and look for our happiness there, because he says in another place that if we don't find it at home, we're not going to find it anywhere. And what's happening in the heart is really enriching all of those things that are in our life, and of course keeping them in perspective, so that they're becoming more and more the way we respond to God. We can't sit down in church and pray for 10 hours a day, but we can live for 10 hours a day. And as we come closer to the Lord and the union deepens, then our life becomes the principal response, the principal prayer that we make to the Lord. And I think that's very much what Teresa is getting at. She says here it's good to be friendly with those who are friends of the Lord. In other words, I think religious life came to be a community life because people wanted to come together. I think Father Greg this morning spoke about young people wanting to come together for a different type of life. And I think community, the community of faith, is meant to be a community that strengthens us in our desire to go to God. Because in most things, you can do things in community that you can't do alone. So the point she's making is that we need to not only be friends with them, but to consult them. Father Greg pointed out that Teresa herself had great helps from very significant people, and I think we too need that sort of a help. You don't have to wait till Peter of Alcantara comes along, or somebody like him. There weren't too many of those even in the 16th century. But within the context of the parish, within the context of adult education in the diocese, we need to be looking around and seeing how we can find help in our journey to God. She says that this is not a mansion of consolation, and to build our desires on consolation is like building on the house of sand. You recall the gospel story about the storm that blew, and the house that was built on sand collapsed, and the house that was built on rock stood. So this is not the time to be looking for consolation. She says it's presumptuous to be looking for them. This is not the foundation for going further. And of course there's a temptation. Really what Teresa has done in these early mansions has painted the picture. She said, look what's there, and you want to get there. But we are still at an early stage of the journey here, and the result is that it would be wrong to be expecting the consolations that will come later. Her message is more to embrace the cross. I think I said that the other day. When you go to prayer, go to give rather than receive. You will all receive, but you won't always feel that you will receive, and sometimes that can stop people going. But if you go to give, you can always give, and I think that's the important thing that will take us back to prayer. She talks here about conformity to the will of God is the foundation for going on. So what we've got to do is conform our will to the will of God. We saw yesterday that that was an important thing for Teresa, that we were not just to want to do our will, but like the Lord, let not my will, but thine be done. And of course, in this early stage, it can be quite a temptation that we want to do it our way. And it can be difficult to be able to sort of conform our life to live as the Lord wants us to live. She points out that they can still fall. People in this mansion are not yet immune from falling. I suppose nobody's ever immune from falling, but they're less likely to fall at a later stage. And she makes the point that the Lord is letting us know our weakness and our humility. So that humility coming up time and time again, that what they must do is get up and begin again. A relapse, a going backward, is worse than a fall. I sometimes say to people that a fall is not necessarily failure. Failure is a bigger thing, that we can fall and get up. Failure, I think, is when we don't get up. Some fall back, some stay here, others go on. And she suggests that this is often determined by their response to the trials God sends them. They have some devotion. I'm just going to read that last paragraph because this is not Teresa. This is somebody else writing about this stage of the journey. Somebody else is a French author, Auguste Soudreau. May not be the correct way of pronouncing it, but this little book is 120 years old, and he comments on Teresa's 7 mansions, but it does so by bringing other insights from other authors. And he sums up this mansion. They have some devotion, do more than required. They can go to daily mass and say the rosary, but without much further. Their prayer can be self-centered. So they're moving in a good direction, but there's still things to be on the lookout for. They can be easily led to spiritual things, but can also give them up easily. This is a state of intermittent piety. Their faith is sincere, and they have good dispositions. They are established in goodness. Their thoughts are still more natural, though they have religious thoughts which come from outside themselves, not welling up from within yet. Continual recollection that is to come comes from gentleness and not by force. So you can see that these first 2 mansions are at the beginning of the journey. The man I just quoted suggests that the first 2 mansions are what we call the purgative way. You may not be aware that over the centuries people have divided the journey to God in the purgative way, the beginning stage, the illuminative way, the more mature stage, and the unitive way, which would be Teresa's 5 mansions, 5, 6, and 7. Well, that's all that I want to do at this stage. I'll return to some of that, but can I suggest we just have a break now, just for a few minutes, to give you a chance to respond to what has been said and perhaps to articulate your own thoughts. I've often mentioned John Cassian in these talks, and I've mentioned that I have a special relationship with him. I did my thesis on him, and my thesis was on the 8 principal vices of the monk. and the 8 principal vices of the monk shortly after Cassian became the 7 deadly sins. And you still find in John of the Cross, for example, when he talks about the problems of beginners, and we've been talking about beginners, that those 8 vices, and for Cassian they were gluttony, fornication, lust, anger, avarice, acedia. You probably don't know that, but it's putting off things spiritually, dejection, vanity, and pride. And that first Machen is where one is beginning to come into contact with those things, that when we talk about self-knowledge, they're the things that we find, because they're the things that can lead us away from the Lord, and they're the things where we get our heart in order. So when we come to the third Machen, we're actually talking about people who have begun that struggle, but they've going to have some control over their own heart. And so Teresa says, they long not to offend the Lord, and they guard against venial sin, are fond of doing penance, and have time for recollection. They spend their time well and do good works. They are charitable to their neighbour, are balanced in their speech and dress, and they govern their households. They desire to go on. I just want to pull out 2 things from that statement of St Teresa. The first is regard to venial sin. We don't mention much these days mortal and venial sin. It's been part of our tradition, but when was the last time you heard a homily on mortal or venial sin? Now, the fact that we don't talk about it so much doesn't mean that it's not a reality, but we are all aware that we can offend God in a serious way. I want to focus more on what we used to call venial sins, which really is not something that can break the relationship we have with God, but it's something that can make it more difficult for us to relate to God. The characteristic, I think, of the third Machen is the practice of the virtues. In the first purgative way, in a sense, we were people who kept the commandments. And now, as we've grown, we want to practice the virtues. And when we're talking about venial sin, we're talking about the fact that we fail in relationship to the virtues. And we can all do that, because so often, just our natural tendency is not to live according to the virtues. So venial sin becomes very big in the writings of the spiritual writers, because people don't sort of give it the prominence that they give mortal sin. Obviously, you don't want to have the shroud thrown over the presence of the castle within, but people don't give as much attention to venial sin. But unless we are willing to practice the virtues and overcome these violations of the virtues, then I think we're not going to go on. The second thing she says, that they guard against venial sin, are fond of doing penance, and that's mortification. I mentioned the other day about the arch, the keystone is prayer, the arch, the sides is the virtues. In other words, working with the virtues. Yesterday when we spoke about detachment from self, we spoke about mortification. In other words, overcoming our desire for natural comfort and things to do our way, do things our way. We can deny ourselves. The Lord said, if anyone will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. So this is a stage where these people are into mortification, and they're happy to do that because they can see that that's going to take them further. It's like the athlete that does extraordinary training and does all sorts of things, drawn on by the hope of the glory of the wreath, the winner's wreath. He says it's not enough to say, or she says, it's not enough to say that they want to go on. Their love needs to be proved. She says she has in mind, as she writes this, the rich young man in the gospel. What do I have to do to be perfect? And the Lord said, keep the commandments. And he said, I've done all that. And he said, go sell what you have and follow me. But he went away. Right? He just couldn't go on. So she has in mind here good people, but good people who are listening to the call, and they just need to be careful that they don't fall back. What is the difficulties they face here? I think this can be a very difficult time. She talks about dryness in prayer. I'm not sure that she talks about dryness in life, but I wrote that in there because I think it's dryness in life, and I think she agrees with that. In other words, it's that situation where nothing seems to be happening, right? In our life, we don't seem to be getting the joy out of the things that we did in the past, and we find that life is just going on and we're doing the things that we need to do, but nothing seems to be happening. And Teresa's response to that is that there's a tension there between, on the one hand, consolations, wanting consolations, and the other, this dryness that we find in our heart. And again, it's sticking with that dryness in the heart that is the important thing. I was reading St John of the Cross as I was preparing this as well, and he has those famous three signs that he suggests are important, moving from meditative type prayer to a contemplative prayer. And one of the signs that he gives is that the soul finds no pleasure in God or in the world. In other words, it's a situation in one's life where we just can't seem to find pleasure anywhere. And that this is not a sign that you've slipped back and you're back in mansion 1 or heading out the gate, but rather that is part of the sign of growth. Because as we approach the 3rd and 4th mansions, traditionally, according to my author here, the illuminative path of the journey, this is the stage prior to entering into the stage where God actually takes over. And this is where John talks about that movement away from more active types of prayer and meditation to a quieter form of prayer that we'll talk about in the next mansion. So I wanted to suggest that the struggle that Teresa is having, and she says that she is having it, could well be that stage of our journey where we are beginning to not find pleasure in God or in anything. We're not being able to meditate as we used to do, but we're still conscious of God and conscious that we want to be conscious of God. I believe that is contemplation. We think of contemplation as great consolations, but that experience is really contemplation. And why is it so bad? Because we are not yet able to interpret, to receive that intervention from God. So to talk about contemplation is not necessarily just to talk about great things and feeling good, that even then when God begins to move into our life, we don't really understand that intervention of God. She actually opens the 3rd mansion speaking about that saying of the scriptures, blessed is he who fears the Lord. We don't like to talk about fear often these days, but the scriptures tell us that fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And the Old Testament often talks about its good people as people who fear the Lord. So what she wants to say here is that it's the fear of not pleasing God, of losing our relationship with God, and of falling back. She makes the point that many arrive at this state situation that we're talking about, but some fall back. She looks at David and Saul, the great kings of Israel, both privileged by God, but both of whom fell away. So the point that she's trying to make is that having fear of the Lord is an important thing in our life, and it's not a frightened fear, but it's that fear of not being able to respond to the Lord as we would like to do. And to bring up the refrain again, humility is the key here. With humility present, this is a most excellent stage, because you're happy to be there. It's not where you want to be, but that's what humility is about, being ready to accept what the Lord gives to us. So this stage, difficult as it might be, with humility, is turned into a very positive place. But she says without it, one will remain here with many afflictions and miseries. So humility, she said somewhere, it's the ointment of of our wounds. So that this difficult time, and we should expect the difficult time to come as we try to break through to our union with the Lord, accepted with humility. It's not that feeling of nothing's happening and, I've been doing it for so long, why doesn't something happen? No, we should be ready to do it because it is what the Lord calls us to do.